Okay, so think about China on a map. You see those clear borders, right?
Hmm.
A very distinct nation-state.
Mm-hmm. Standard modern map.
But what if I told you that, well, for most of its really long history, China wasn't really about lines on a map?
Yeah, it's a fascinating point. It wasn't defined by geography or even just one ethnicity or a single religion.
Exactly. And that's the kind of extraordinary idea we're digging into today. We're looking at historian Xu Zhuoyun's work on Tianxia.
Which gets translated usually as the all-under-heaven state or sometimes the all-encompassing realm.
Right. It's a really foundational concept, isn't it?
Absolutely is. And it gives you, the listener, a kind of shortcut to understanding the essence of Chinese identity over millennia.
So our mission today is really to unpack this big question. How did this unique vision of China, as this fluid, culturally defined community not stuck with fixed borders, how did it even start? How did it evolve, reach its peak, and then eventually transform?
We're basically following its whole journey, from its ancient roots through its real golden age, and then into how it got redefined later on.
So get ready for, well, I think a really fascinating look at how things like geography, culture, and the way things were governed all kind of twisted together to shape one of the world's oldest civilizations.
Okay, so to really get our heads around Tianxia, we first need to sort of challenge our modern ideas. Forget fixed geographical borders for a moment.
Right. That's the key starting point.
This was a state defined almost entirely by cultural recognition. Think of it like this. Any group, didn't matter where they came from or their ethnicity, could become part of this huge cultural community.
Just by identifying with and adopting the culture.
Exactly. By adopting Chinese culture.
That is such a different way of thinking compared to, modern nation states where your citizenship is tied to where you were born or where the lines are drawn.
It really is. And it's especially striking when you think modern China, with its current borders, is less than 70 years old.
Wow. And it definitely pushes back against that idea of China as just one single ethnic group. The sources mentioned, 56 officially recognized groups today?
That's right. And even the main group, the Han, is itself this historical mosaic formed by integrating many different peoples over centuries.
So not ethnic borders.
No. And this Tianxia wasn't about pushing one single religion either. Confucianism became really important later, yes, but Buddhism, Taoism, they flourished right alongside it.
And even Christianity and Islam found a place.
They did at various points. They took root, thrived within China's history. That fluidity, that adaptability is just crucial to understanding its unique origins.
But okay, how did this boundaryless idea actually, take root? Where did it come from?
Well, surprisingly, a big part of the answer is in the land itself, the geography.
How so?
Think about other ancient cradles of civilization. The Nile Valley, Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus Valley. They often had natural barriers, right? Deserts, mountains, seas.
Oh, yeah, they were more contained.
But the Yellow River Basin, where Chinese civilization really got going, it was different. It was vast, open. It didn't have those kinds of sharp natural barriers.
Okay, so imagine looking out and just seeing land stretching on and on.
Exactly. That feeling, that visual of endlessness, seems to have inspired the ancient Chinese to think of their territory not as a country with limits, but as this entire world, this Tianxia that needed governing.
So not defining as by mountain range, but by something else.
By culture, primarily. And this influenced how they governed right from the start. Instead of conquering and drawing lines, they thought more in terms of radiating influence outwards.
And this led to that concentric circle model you hear about.
Precisely. Look at the Shang dynasty, the early prototype. Their capital moved around quite a bit, but the effect was expansion outwards, covering more of the central plains.
So how did that structure work?
It was layered. You had the capital at the very center, then royal family members guarding key spots nearby, then smaller cities run by imperial envoys, then allied city-states further out.
And right at the edge?
The Fang groups, often semi-nomadic, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies. It was about influence, not hard borders.
Then the Zhou dynasty came along and made it more formal.
They really did. They inherited the Shang model and institutionalized it. They settled in Shaanxi, a strategic area, but also built a second capital, Luoyang, right in the heart of the Central Plains to exert control.
And they used that clan system.
Yes, the Zongfa system and Fenjin, the enfafment system. Basically, they granted land and titles to relatives and allies, creating numerous vassal states.
In exchange for?
Loyalty, tribute, and military service to the Zhou king, the son of heaven. This created the strong pull towards the center, really starting to integrate the Central Plains into one cohesive um, cultural zone.
Okay, so if geography didn't draw the lines and it wasn't ethnicity,
hmm
how did they know who was in and who was out? You mentioned culture.
Exactly. It came down to cultural boundaries, specifically lifestyle and customs.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The Book of Rice, one of the classics, paints these pictures. It describes the Yi people to the east using bows and arrows, living by hunting. The Dai to the north are associated with shepherd dogs and fires, suggesting herding.
So it's about how they lived.
Primarily, and the Zhu really solidified this into what's called the Huayi distinction. Hua, or Huaxia, were those who adopted the Central Plains way of life, the rituals, the music, the agriculture. Yi, or Yidi, were those who didn't.
And this feels like the really crucial part. That line wasn't fixed, was it?
No, that's what makes Tianxia Guoji so dynamic. It wasn't a racial thing. The sources are clear. And Yidi group could actually become Huaxia
How?
by adopting the culture. There's a famous example. Zhang Taigong was sent to establish the state of Qi in Shandong, a region with many Dongyi people. His job was basically to assimilate them.
And did it work?
Over time, yes. By the Warring States period, centuries later, those former Dongyi were fully part of Qi state, completely integrated into the broader Huaxia identity. This cultural assimilation, this absorption, was the engine driving the expansion of the Tianxia Guojia.
So it was a prototype built on culture, shaped by geography, and structured by the Zhu systems.
A prototype, yes. But a fairly fragile one initially, especially when things started falling apart during the spring and autumn and warring states periods. All those Huaxia states started fighting each other.
That chaos must have been terrifying.
It was, but ironically, that very chaos, that breakdown, fueled this deep longing for a better, more perfect Tianxia Guojia, an ideal version.
And this ideal got written down.
It did. In Confucian texts like the Chenghui Gongyang's Yuan, it laid out 3 stages towards ultimate unity. Stage 1. Enter its own state, out of the various Huaxia states.
Which sounds like the Warring States period itself, right? Huaxia states wary of each other.
Exactly. Then, stage 2. Enter the various Huaxia states, outer the Yidi. Now, the Huaxia world is united, like one family, but still sees itself as distinct from the surrounding Yidi groups who haven't joined the cultural sphere yet.
And this is where Qin and Han come in.
Yeah.
They achieve this stage.
Pretty much, yes. They put stage 2 into practice, and then there was the ultimate goal, stage 3, heaven and earth, big or small, near or far, are one.
Universal unity. No more us and them at all.
The ultimate ideal. Total cultural integration, no boundaries left. And remarkably, the Sui and especially the Tang dynasties got closest to actually achieving this.
Okay, let's back up to stage 2 then. Qin and Han. How did they achieve that unification of the Huaxia world?
They focused intensely on centralization. Politically, they built a system where power reached right down to the villages. They controlled population counts, property.
Even collecting head taxes at the local level, that's direct intervention.
Very direct. Economically, they unified everything. Currency, weights, measures. The Hanwuzu coin was incredibly successful, lasted for centuries, even into the Tang era.
And infrastructure too, right? Those roads.
Absolutely. Sima Qian writes about this network of 3 vertical, 3 horizontal roads covering the empire. It wasn't just for administration. It boosted trade immensely.
What about culture? Unifying thought seems harder.
It was. The Qin tried a top-down approach, rule by law, teaching by officials, and it kind of backfired.
Why?
It clashed too much with local customs. For example, their laws requiring neighbors to spy on each other went against traditional village values of mutual help.
So how did the Han succeed?
Emperor Wu promoted Confucianism, exclusive reverence for Confucianism. But the key was that Confucian values, things like filial piety, respecting elders, neighborly harmony, they actually resonated with existing popular customs. So it felt less imposed, more like an absorption. It unified thought gradually from the bottom up as well as top down.
And
A really cohesive Huaxia civilization emerged, strong enough to defeat major external threats like the Xiongnu nomads to the north, confident enough to expand the Silk Road westward into Central Asia.
that sounds like a huge success in unification. But thinking about that ultimate Tianxia ideal, was something still missing?
Yeah.
Even after Qin and Han.
Oh, absolutely. What was missing was stage 3, getting rid of that outer the Yidi distinction altogether.
Because the Xiongnu were still out there.
Exactly. They were pushed back, but other nomadic groups emerged. The Great Wall is the perfect symbol of this.
How so?
It was a massive physical boundary. It clearly marked the line between the unified agricultural society of the Central Plains and the nomadic world. It said, very clearly, you are still outside. The outer Yidi were still distinct, a potential threat needing a wall.
Right. The wall is a statement of separation, not inclusion, which makes the Tang dynasty even more radical.
Totally. Because, as the sources say, the Tang effectively abandoned the Great Wall as a primary line of defense.
Just stop maintaining it.
Their focus shifted. They weren't about building walls. They were about building an open Tianxia State. They brought incredibly diverse groups from East Asia, Central Asia, the steppes into one cultural community. It was the pinnacle.
Okay, so how did they achieve this boundaryless state? You mentioned 3 areas.
Yes. First, institutions without boundaries. They blended systems. Take the Fubing military system.
The soldier-farmer one.
Right, originally from the Xianbei people, a northern group. But under them, it was racially segregated. Xianbei were soldiers, Han were farmers. The Tang changed that.
Tough.
They broke the racial barrier. Han and non-Han could both farm and fight. And crucially, military command was centralized under the emperor, not tribal nobles. It became a flexible system that worked for everyone, regardless of ethnicity.
Okay, that's institutions. What about culture?
Culture without boundaries. The Tang just soaked up foreign influences into everyday life. Hu-style clothing became fashionable, replacing traditional robes. Hu foods, pepper, new grains entered the diet.
So it wasn't just high-level stuff.
No, it was daily life. And knowledge, too. Indian mathematics, medicine, Central Asian astronomy, they were all integrated. And critically, unlike the Han, they tolerated religious diversity.
We mentioned that earlier. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam.
Right. Buddhism localized into distinctively Chinese forms like Zen. Manichaeism, Nestorian Christianity, Islam came with traders and flourished. This wasn't just tolerance, it was active absorption and integration, reflecting this grand cultural confidence.
Amazing. And the third area, diplomacy.
Diplomacy without boundaries. Emperor Taizong wasn't just China's emperor. Steppe tribes honored him as Heavenly Khan, making him a leader in both worlds.
A dual role.
Exactly. And leaders of surrounding groups willingly submitted, receiving official Tang titles. Even, incredibly, the top general in Japan held a Tang-bestowed title.
Wow. And foreigners could actually work for the government.
Yes. This is maybe the most stunning part. They could take the imperial exams, the toughest exams in the world, and become officials. We know of Koreans like Yuan becoming a magistrate, a Japanese student, Abno Nakamaro becoming an imperial advisor.
That level of openness in the bureaucracy is pretty rare in history generally, let alone Chinese history.
Extremely rare. It shows how seriously they took the Tianxia ideal that talent and cultural identification mattered more than origin. So yeah, because of this openness in institutions, culture, and diplomacy, the Tang really represents the most perfect, most complete form of the Tianxia State.
But, as often happens with golden ages, it didn't last forever.
No, sadly it didn't. After the Tang, the system began to decline. By the time we get to the Ming and Qing dynasties centuries later, China looks very different. Much more closed, more rigid. It lost that inclusiveness.
Why? What happened?
2 main reasons stand out. One is cultural closure, which actually started brewing back in the Song dynasty. The other is political autocracy, which really took hold under the Yuan and intensified in the Ming and Qing.
Okay, let's take cultural closure first. What drove that?
A shift in philosophy. Neo-Confucianism, particularly the Zhou school, became the official state ideology in the Ming and Qing, and it was, well, a very rigid system. It centered on concepts like Tianli, heavenly principle. This was seen as the absolute, unchanging basis for everything: nature, society, relationships. Think of it like this.
Like a giant invisible net.
Kinda. A meticulously woven net covering everything, prescribing the proper place and relation for all things. It left very little room for flexibility or alternative ideas.
And the other concept?
Datong, the Wei tradition. This idea emphasized the unique, unbroken line of Han Chinese culture, passed down directly from ancient sages. It was explicitly used to resist foreign influence.
So a very inward-looking turn.
Exactly. It shifted the focus from the Tang's confident, outward-looking embrace of diversity to a much more conservative, inward-looking stance focused on cultural purity.
It's like turning graphite into diamond, you said earlier.
Yeah, it becomes purer, harder, more defined, but it loses that ability to absorb and adapt. It can't incorporate outside influences anymore.
And this started in the Song.
The roots are there. Remember, the Song wasn't a dominant Tianxia like the Tang. They were one state among several powerful neighbors, Liao, Jin, Sixia. They were under constant military pressure.
So they felt they needed to define themselves more strongly.
It seems so. They lost the Tang's expansive confidence and began to sort of purify Han culture, emphasizing what made it unique. Neo-Confucianism was the intellectual result of that pressure. It was strong, coherent, but ultimately closed.
And the consequences of this closure.
It led to policies like the Ming's ban on maritime trade and exploration. China started to fall behind global trends, especially in science and technology, because it became resistant to absorbing foreign knowledge. This made it much more vulnerable later on.
Okay, so that's cultural closure. What about the political side, the autocracy?
This also has roots earlier, particularly in the Yuan dynasty, but it really ramps up in the Ming. The founder, Xu Zhuoyun, made a huge change. He abolished the position of prime minister.
Taking all that power for himself.
Completely. All power was centralized in the emperor. This removed the traditional balance, or at least check, that the civil bureaucracy led by the prime minister could provide against imperial power.
And didn't the Ming have those secret police?
Infamously, yes. The Jinyue, the Dongchang, the Xichang, and eunuchs gained enormous power, specifically to spy on the officials. This level of surveillance directly serving the emperor was pretty unique to the Ming.
And that awful Tingzang, the public beatings of officials.
Yes, the court beatings. It symbolized the total subservience of the bureaucracy. Earlier dynasties, even if tense, often had more mutual respect between the emperor and ministers. Ming autocracy was far more absolute.
And the king followed suit.
They inherited and continued this Ming absolutism, relying heavily on their own military power, the Eight Banners. Decision-making was extremely centralized, often through bodies like the Grand Council, which reported directly to the emperor, bypassing older bureaucratic checks.
You mentioned the Yuan dynasty's role here.
Yeah, their legacy was quite negative in this respect. As a dynasty founded by conquest, they ruled largely through military force. They significantly reduced the importance of the civil service exams and the scholar officials.
Undermining that traditional check on power.
Exactly. By weakening the traditional scholar bureaucracy, they broke that balance, paving the way for the extreme autocracy we see in the Ming and Qing.
So what was the impact of all this autocracy?
It really stifled society. When all power is at the top and dissent is dangerous, creativity suffers. Scholars became more subservient, less innovative. You see it in the arts. For example, Qing painting is often seen as technically skilled but largely imitative, lacking the boldness of earlier periods.
And a rigid society can't adapt well.
No, it couldn't respond effectively to external shocks. When Western powers arrived with advanced science and technology, the reaction from the deeply autocratic king, court, and bureaucracy was often blind rejection or fear, rather than strategic learning and adaptation. It just deepened China's isolation.
So let's just wrap this up. We've traced this incredible journey of the Tianxia, the all-under-heaven state.
Yeah, starting as this idea shaped by geography, defined by culture, not borders, all about absorption.
Reaching that amazing peak in the Tang dynasty, just radical openness in institutions, culture, diplomacy, a truly borderless identity for its time.
But then the decline. The turn inwards during the song, leading to the cultural conservatism of Neo-Confucianism and the political autocracy hardening in the Ming and Qing. Rigidity and closure took over.
And of course, today, China is very much a modern nation state. It has those clear borders we see on the map.
Right, and its culture is often framed now in terms of its specific Chineseness, the culture of the Chinese people, rather than that older, more universal concept that could theoretically embrace anyone.
So thinking about this whole long story, what does it mean for us today, for you listening? This journey of the all-under-heaven state kind of leaves us with a big question, doesn't it?
It really does. In our own world, which is so interconnected, how do we find that balance between national identity, cultural uniqueness, and that universal desire for connection, for understanding, cooperation?
Yeah, does a concept like a truly borderless cultural community defined by shared values and just mutual recognition, does it still have any relevance? Or are we, in the end, always going to be defined by those lines on a map? Something to think about.